In December of 1846, a merchant named Charles Bent sat in an office on the Santa Fe Plaza holding the title of territorial governor, a title the United States Army had handed him 4 months earlier, and a title almost nobody in the valley around him had agreed to recognize. General Stephen Kearny had marched into Santa Fe that August with roughly 1,700 men at the end of an 856-mile march from Fort Leavenworth and taken the town without a single shot fired because the Mexican governor, Manuel Armijo, had already retreated south. Kearny stood in the plaza and declared the province under United States authority and promised in the same breath that property, religion, and local rights and customs would be respected. On the 22nd of September that same year, he put the promise into writing. 4 Missouri lawyers traveling with his volunteers drafted what became known as the Kearny Code, a Bill of Rights and a body of law stitched together from Missouri statute, Texas law, and the Mexican Code already in force, printed on a press owned by a Taos priest named Antonio José Martinez, one of the most prominent Hispano leaders in the territory. The code promised to leave existing property arrangements standing. What Kearny left behind, once the printing was finished and he rode west toward California 6 days later, was a provisional government built on that paper promise, sitting on top of a population that had not been asked whether it wanted the promise kept by strangers. Somewhere in the adobe rooms off that same plaza, in the final weeks of that same December, a plan was already moving through the valley to test it. Local families and Taos Pueblo men were organizing what would later be called the Christmas Conspiracy, a coordinated uprising timed to strike Santa Fe and the northern settlements at once. American authorities learned of it before it could happen. The plan was postponed, not abandoned, and the water that ran through the plaza that winter, down the centuries-old ditch the town depended on for every crop and every household, kept moving the same way it had moved for over 200 years, indifferent to which government claimed to control it, and indifferent to whichever code had just been read aloud a few streets away. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the water was moving through is the part of this record that survives. And it survives because stone and packed earth do not depend on who is currently in charge. The Acequia Madre, the mother ditch, was already more than 2 centuries old by the winter Bent took his office. Spanish colonists had dug it in the early 1600s, widening channels that Pueblo communities had used to move river water onto crops long before any Spaniard reached the Rio Grande Valley. The word itself, acequia, traces back through Spanish to Arabic, to the word for that which brings water, carried across the Atlantic by colonizers who had learned the technique from Moorish engineers centuries earlier, and then imposed it, and in places forced local labor to dig it, onto New Mexican soil. By the 1840s, the system had become something closer to law than infrastructure. A mayordomo, elected by the families who depended on a given ditch, controlled the schedule of who received water and when, a system called repartimiento, apportionment, enforced not by a distant government, but by the people standing in the field beside you. It was not a suggestion. In a high desert, where a bad water year could mean a starved winter, it was survival, administered communally, generation after generation, through a chain of trust that had outlasted Spanish rule and Mexican rule both. What the incoming Americans could not immediately grasp, because nothing in their own legal tradition had prepared them for it, was that this water system and the land grants it served were not separate from Pueblo or Hispano identity in this valley. They were the thing itself. You can still see the physical shape of that older law today, in a way that most legal systems from this period leave no trace of at all. The Acequia Madre runs at an elevation of roughly 7,000 feet, cut along a course that has changed little enough that a 19th century mayordomo would still recognize the line of it, banked in packed earth, shaded by cottonwoods that were themselves planted to hold the banks in place. Land along its route was historically deeded in long, narrow strips running perpendicular to the ditch, so that every household, however small its holding, touched the water directly, rather than depending on a neighbor upstream to pass along what remained. That layout is not decorative. It is a legal record laid out in dirt, a physical map of an equity system, and it predates any American surveyor who ever set foot in the territory. A count taken in 1919 found nearly 40 separate acequias, still threading through Santa Fe alone, with hundreds more following the river downstream through the valley. A network dense enough that the word ribboned is the one historians actually use to describe what the town looked like from above, before any of the dams that would later cut that network down to a fraction of its size had been built. The record of what came next is unusually precise for a period this violent, because the men involved wrote down what they knew and what they feared in real time. On the 14th of January 1847, the outgoing secretary of the territory, a New Mexican named Donaciano Vigil, warned Bent directly against traveling north to Taos, where Bent kept his family home. The climate following the suppressed Christmas conspiracy was too unstable, Vigil told him. Bent went anyway. 5 days later, on the morning of the 19th, a combined force of Taos Pueblo men and Hispano insurgents, led by a Pueblo man named Tomás Romero, known as Tomasito, and a local figure named Pablo Montoya, broke down the door of the Bent household. Bent's own 5-year-old daughter, Teresina, later wrote an account of what she watched from inside that house. Bent tried to reason with the men at his door. He was shot with arrows and gunfire, and then scalped in front of his wife, his children, and his sister-in-law, who was married to Kit Carson. The family escaped by digging through an interior adobe wall into the house next door, while Bent lay dying with arrows still in him. In the days that followed, insurgents killed several more Americans and Mexican officials loyal to the new government, burned a distillery at Arroyo Hondo owned by an American settler, and killed 7 more men at Mora. Colonel Sterling Price marched from Santa Fe with 480 soldiers and 4 pieces of artillery. Within weeks, the rebellion had been crushed at Taos Pueblo itself, where American cannon fire destroyed the second San Geronimo mission church after Pueblo families and Hispano fighters retreated inside it, believing the church would still function as sanctuary, a tradition centuries old by that point. It did not. The dead inside that church were never formally counted in most American records of the campaign. The building's ruins were left standing, and for decades afterward the site served as a burial ground for Taos Pueblo families, a use that continued until a new cemetery was designated in the 1990s. What followed the fighting was not simply military occupation, but formal prosecution. American courts, sitting in territory the United States had held for barely 6 months, tried surviving insurgents for treason against a government most of the defendants had never agreed to owe allegiance to in the first place, and Taos Plaza saw public hangings in the weeks that followed the trials, an outcome even some American observers at the time considered legally strained, given that the men in the dock were being convicted of betraying a nation whose citizenship had never actually been extended to them. That is the violent half of the record, and it is the half most history remembers, because it produced a body, a name, a battle, and a trial. What it obscures, and what the Christmas conspiracy in Santa Fe makes visible if you look at the 2 events side by side, is that the uprising itself was never really about one governor. It was about water and land, and who would be permitted to keep controlling both. The plotted Santa Fe Rising in December was discovered and diffused through informants before a shot was fired, which means it left almost no physical trace, no burned building, no scalped official, nothing for a battlefield marker to commemorate. Its own leaders were never publicly identified in the surviving American record with the same certainty as Tomasito or Pablo Montoya, because a plot stopped in its planning stage rarely generates the paperwork a completed one does. The Taos Rising a month later, discovered too late to stop, left arrows in a dying man and cannon damage in a church wall that stood as a visible ruin for a century and a half. Same fear, same season, same population, spread across settlements that shared families, trade routes, and in many cases the same Acequia associations, and yet 2 entirely different outcomes, depending entirely on whether American authorities heard about the plan in time. What connects them is not conspiracy. It is a documented, dated, repeated pattern of New Mexican and Pueblo communities organizing independently and simultaneously across multiple settlements Against a government that had arrived promising to respect land titles and water rights, it had no functioning mechanism yet in place to actually honor. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The promise came formally the following year. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February of 1848, ended the war and explicitly recognized the personal and property rights of New Mexicans and Pueblo people brought under American sovereignty, including the century-old practice of acequia irrigation. On paper, the fear that had driven both conspiracies was addressed. In practice, the paper did almost nothing. The federal government did not create a body to actually adjudicate the old Spanish and Mexican land grants until 1854, when it established the office of the Surveyor General of New Mexico, and did not create a full court for the purpose until the Court of Private Land Claims in 1891, 43 years after the treaty that supposedly guaranteed the underlying rights. In the intervening decades, an entire generation of families who had farmed the same fields their grandparents farmed, under Spanish and Mexican deeds, were left holding paper the new government had no functioning mechanism to honor, forced to defend titles in a language and a legal procedure most of them had never been trained to navigate, often against speculators who understood exactly how long the wait would run and exactly how much a tired claimant would eventually settle for. Of roughly 180 non-Pueblo land grant claims that Surveyor General reviewed, only 46 were confirmed. The Court of Private Land Claims, over its 13-year existence, considered 282 claims and confirmed 82. The numbers alone tell you what the treaty's language could not enforce on its own. Most families who believed they held legal title under Spanish or Mexican law were, decades later, told by an American court that they did not, and even a confirmed claim was frequently confirmed for a fraction of the acreage the original grant had described, the difference absorbed into the public domain or sold off in the process of proving the claim at all. Water followed the same arc as land, on a slightly slower timeline, and the record here has names attached to it too, which is what separates it from a vague grievance and makes it traceable. New Mexico passed its first American water law in 1851. In 1861, the territorial legislature went further, passing an act specifically to investigate increasing water flow on the Santa Fe River, an early sign that officials in the new territorial capital were already thinking about that water in terms of measurement and yield rather than customary apportionment. For 30 years after the first water law, the Acequia system kept functioning largely as it always had, community-managed, mayordomo administered, water apportioned by need rather than by capital. Then, in 1879, a private company called the Santa Fe Water and Improvement Company filed a certificate of incorporation with the county. The county commissioners granted that company the exclusive right to build dams and reservoirs and impound water on the Santa Fe River, a river that centuries of Acequia law had treated as a shared resource rather than a private one. The company built 4 dams on the river between 1881 and 1943, seizing the majority of the flow for hydroelectric power rather than irrigation, and the company itself later passed, through further consolidation, into what is today part of a public utility still operating in the state. One of the men most closely associated with the broader privatization of New Mexican water and land in this period was Thomas Catron, a former Confederate officer turned territorial politician and land speculator, whose name is still attached by historians to what became known as the Santa Fe Ring, a loosely organized network of appointed officials, lawyers, and capitalists who used their knowledge of American law and their political access to a legal system many New Mexican families could not read in its own language, to accumulate enormous holdings of formerly communal land and water across the territory in the decades after the treaty. The ring's influence reached directly into the land claims process itself, since the same men positioned to profit from a failed grant claim were often the ones with the legal standing to argue it before the Surveyor General and the courts that followed. By the time a 1919 survey counted the ditches still operating in Santa Fe, the network had shrunk to fewer than 40, down from a system that had once threaded the entire valley and its downstream reach with hundreds more. The dams did not announce themselves as an extension of what the Christmas conspirators and the Taos rebels had feared in the winter of 1846. They did not need to. They simply finished, through incorporation papers and engineering rather than arrows or cannon fire, what neither army nor treaty language had settled by force. What makes this pattern worth stopping on, rather than filing away as one more story of broken treaty promises, is how narrow the surviving physical evidence actually is, and how specific its condition remains today. The San Geronimo church ruin at Taos Pueblo still stands, roofless, its adobe walls open to weather, maintained deliberately in that unrestored state as a marker rather than rebuilt, a choice the Pueblo has made and kept for over a century and a half. The house on Bent Street in Taos, where Charles Bent died, still stands as well, now a small museum, its adobe walls holding the same interior wall his family dug through in the last minutes of his life. The Acequia Madre in Santa Fe still runs, not as a museum piece but as active infrastructure, water moving through the same channel Spanish colonists widened and Pueblo communities used before them, still governed in principle by a mayordomo, and still legally recognized under New Mexico's water code, a fragment of the repartimiento system that outlasted the empire that formalized it, the war that followed it, and the corporation that tried to dam it out of relevance. All three of these things exist in the present tense. You can walk to any of them. None requires a metal detector, an excavation permit, or a claim about a suppressed government file, because the record was never hidden. It was distributed, unevenly, across a legal system slow enough and indifferent enough that most of the people it displaced did not live to see any resolution at all, and thorough enough in its paperwork that a historian today can still trace, contract by contract and confirmation by confirmation, exactly how much of it was lost and to whom. Return to Charles Bent's office on the Santa Fe Plaza in December of 1846, because the detail that gets lost in the story of his death a month later is what the conspiracy in Santa Fe itself was actually organized around before it was discovered and stopped. It was not a plot against one man. It was a plan by people who had watched a new government arrive with soldiers and paperwork and take control of a valley whose water had been apportioned by community vote for 2 centuries, and who understood, correctly, that promises written into a treaty are only as real as the institutions built afterward to enforce them. The institutions that mattered here took decades to arrive, and when they did, in the form of surveyor generals and private water companies and a court that confirmed less than a third of the claims it reviewed, they largely confirmed what those conspirators had feared rather than what the treaty had promised. Kearny's proclamation had promised property, religion, and custom would be respected. The record read forward from that promise to the surveyor general's ledger and the water company's certificate of incorporation, shows a government that meant the promise sincerely enough to print it, and lacked for the better part of half a century either the institutions or the will to make it hold. Bent is buried in Taos. The church his killers hoped would shelter them is still a ruin at the Pueblo, left unroofed on purpose. The Christmas conspiracy that never got the chance to become a battle left no monument at all, because a plot stopped in December leaves nothing behind for a marker to describe. And the ditch that every side of that 1846 winter depended on to survive, the mayordomo's water, the repartimiento's law, the century-old channel, none of the paperwork ever fully displaced, is right now carrying water through Santa Fe exactly the way it did the year the Acequia was widened, the year the town changed hands, and every year since, regardless of which office on the plaza believed it was in charge. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.